And greetings to you. Joe Rubenstein here, producer and host of Real-Time 1960s. I want to thank you very much for joining me today for this portal into the past, where I document the 60s in real time with podcasts like this, with our evening news reports with media clips and commercials of the day, as well as our daily timeline. And that timeline, along with each and every podcast, links to social media, how to reach us directly, it's all there for you on our website, realtime1960s.com. And today, we reach the end of our journey through my ranked list of the top 10 films of 1962. In the show notes to this episode, you'll find links to the previous 4 episodes in this series. I've actually just completed my top 10 list for 1963, and we'll get into that on our very next episode. Not quite as strong a year. I'd say 61 and 63 were probably the weakest years of what was a phenomenal, really revolutionary decade in film, both here and abroad. But now, without further ado, my personal pick for the #1 film released in 1962, right now. You know, it's a rare thing, especially in this current period of cultural decline, for a creative effort, whether it's a film, a book, a music group, to be both great and very popular. The amazing thing about the Beatles, to me, is not that they were so good, but, and I suppose this was a triumph of marketing, at least early on, that they also managed to become a worldwide phenomenon while being that good, actually improving as they went along. And To Kill a Mockingbird, my #1 film for 1962, is certainly a great film that was also a popular success when it was released, drawing large audiences nationwide, and now it's firmly established as a classic, with Atticus Finch, the lead character played by Gregory Peck, voted the greatest hero of all American cinema by the American Film Institute in 2003, the year Peck died. So to place this film at the top of my list, it's almost embarrassing how non-controversial it is. It's like coming out very strongly in favor of fresh air or ice cream. But just as it's important, I think, to speak out when popular and or critically acclaimed films are actually not that good, or at least are vastly overrated. We just mentioned 1963, a film released that year, which many highly esteemed critics, directors, film publications have declared the greatest of all time, Federico Fellini's 8½, which decades after seeing and hating it when I was in college, I reviewed with a completely open mind last month as I was creating my list for 63. And despite a few good scenes, and this is coming from someone who admires much of Fellini's earlier work, I concluded once again that the film was boring, pretentious, and self-indulgent. But as important as it is to cast out false idols, I think it's equally important to praise popular or critically acclaimed films if they're also great. So I'm happy to place Mockingbird at the top of my list, though as I said last time, Days of Wine and Roses would be an equally comfortable choice. But To Kill a Mockingbird, in my opinion, is a rare case where a film adaptation of a great or very good novel is actually superior to the book. I read the novel recently and I enjoyed it, but I did not feel it was necessarily worthy of the Pulitzer Prize it received, an award that was especially remarkable in 1961, because it was Harper Lee's first novel, and would be her only novel. I don't count Go Set a Watchman, published in 2015, as that was really an early draft of Mockingbird, which again I enjoyed, but I felt could have used some editing here and there. You get pages of descriptive details, or unremarkable, unenlightening anecdotes, written in fairly humdrum prose that could have been pruned, in my opinion. Which in fact Horton Foote, in adapting it for the screen, did with great expertise. I'll discuss him later. One other minor complaint is a scene that appears in both the novel and the film, and I admit it's a very moving scene, of a lynch mob, the leader of which, or one of the leaders, is kind of shamed out of his immediate goal, which is to murder Tom Robinson, the black man falsely accused of rape, by the innocent presence of Scout, Atticus Finch's daughter. Again, it's very moving in the film. And I get the point, I think, which is that within all of us is a spark of decency. But there's a thin line between that kind of idealism and naivete. And I understand it's not a documentary, but a quick look at history, both in the Deep South and elsewhere, tells us that violent mobs are not so easily or charmingly dissuaded. But the book has definite virtues. Above all, a great story with well-drawn characters, mostly based on real people, and it was a wise, really critical decision by Harper Lee to tell that story with its central theme of societal prejudice, racial and otherwise, through the eyes of children who are not yet fully shaped by society. So, similar to another best-selling novel, The Godfather, by Mario Puzo, which, unlike Mockingbird, received no prizes when it was published in 1969, but was a massive bestseller. And I've never felt that Puzo got enough credit for his contribution to those films. The tragic arc of the story, the characters, that sense of creeping evil, all those elements that make the films so compelling derive directly from the novel, which also, by the way, had a fair amount of filler that needed to be cut for the films. But likewise with this film, the seeds of greatness were certainly planted in Harper Lee's impressive debut novel, and director Robert Mulligan had a tremendous feel for this material. Now, what's interesting about the genesis of this film is that the producer, Alan Pakula, who would go on to direct some very good films in the 70s, most famously his so-called Paranoia trilogy, Clute, The Parallax View, and All the President's Men. But in late 60, early 61, Pakula was happily shocked to discover that the rights to Harper Lee's novel were very much available. Every major studio had passed on adapting this massive bestseller for the big screen. And it wasn't because of any potential controversy or fallout due to the racial theme. You know, I've heard people talk about Mockingbird as if it's the first Hollywood film to deal with race. Not true. Certainly, Imitation of Life, directed by Douglas Sirk and released 3 years earlier, dealt with the problem. That's a film that, like Mockingbird, makes very effective use of dual storylines. The first of which is a romance between Lana Turner and John Gavin, but the other dealing with Turner's black housekeeper, the light-skinned daughter of whom, painfully aware of the limitations imposed upon her by her race, tries and at least temporarily succeeds in passing as white, but in doing so, abandons her dying mother and consigns herself to a kind of false, somewhat paranoid life, with the constant fear of being exposed. Like most of Sirk's films, it's definitely a tearjerker, but very compelling, and it was a big hit, roughly on the scale of Mockingbird. But other, earlier films dealt with the topic as well. Stanley Kramer's The Defiant Ones, released in '58, which I can't recommend quite as strongly. That one deals with two escaped prisoners, one white and one black, played by Tony Curtis and Sidney Poitier, who hate each other, but are shackled together and must cooperate in order to survive. The symbolism is obvious. It's well-intentioned, but like many of Kramer's films, a little heavy-handed. Also, Robert Rawson's Island in the Sun, released in 1957, had presented, although very carefully, a budding but unconsummated interracial romance between Harry Belafonte and Joan Fontaine. But the reason the studios passed on Mockingbird is they just didn't think it was cinematic, or that it had the elements that would normally translate into box office success. There's no romance in the book, there's no action, other than the killing of Tom Robinson, which is described only second-handedly, and which Horton Foote, wisely in my opinion, kept off screen. So the studios read this novel and said, okay, what do we got? A period piece set in small-town Alabama about a middle-aged widower with a couple of kids who loses a court case. Pass. But Pakula and Mulligan saw great cinematic promise in Harper Lee's material if handled correctly. And so finally a deal was set up where the film would be produced by two independent companies and distributed by Universal. So once that deal was struck, Pakula and Mulligan proceeded to make a series of critical home run decisions as far as their creative team on both sides of the camera. Horton Foote, I've already mentioned, came from a small-town Texas environment. Initially a theater actor in the 30s, but by '61 a highly regarded playwright who had also written a bunch for live TV. Actually, it was Foote who recommended Robert Duvall for the role of Boo Radley, the boogeyman turned savior. He had been floored by Duvall's portrayal of an alcoholic in one of his plays, The Midnight Caller, and the two men became very close friends. Actually, decades later, Foote wrote the screenplay for one of the very best films of the 1980s, or any other decade, Tender Mercies, which finally won Duvall his Academy Award. But Horton Foote initially resisted the Mockingbird adaptation job because, oddly enough, he'd related to the novel so deeply and loved it so much, He was afraid to adapt it, he thought he might ruin it. But Pakula arranged a meeting between Foote and Harper Lee. The two Southerners had instant rapport, so he took the job, which ultimately won him an Oscar for Best Adapted Screenplay. But one of my favorite scenes in the movie is not adapted from the novel, but was created by Foote. In the book, the dead mother is barely mentioned by the narrator, who is Scout as an adult, and the mother isn't really discussed by the children at all, which Foote felt was a lack. So he composed a very touching scene early in the film, where the two children are going to sleep, and Scout asks her older brother Jem a series of questions about their mother, whom he remembers but she does not. And during this sleepy, almost ritualistic conversation, you get the sense it's happened before. The camera slowly tilts down out of the bedroom and over to Atticus, who's sitting on the porch by himself, listening to his children talk about his departed wife. And with that wonderfully lyrical score by Elmer Bernstein, who I'll get to, it's an intensely moving scene, with Foote's stylistic trademark, a kind of telegraphic simplicity that still manages to conjure up all sorts of complex emotions. But perhaps the most critical move by Pakula was to send Harper Lee's novel to Gregory Peck, who sat down with it one afternoon in January of '61, finally finishing it in the middle of the night, and he later said he could hardly wait till morning to call Pakula and say yes. Although not a Southerner, Peck had been raised in a small-town environment in Southern California, where there had been a Klan element. So since childhood, he had been aware of and sensitive to discrimination. But in this case, Peck felt an especially close identification with the character of Atticus Finch, who was the kind of man he aspired to be. And his Oscar-winning performance in this film would always be a point of enormous pride. He always said that that day, when Pakula sent him To Kill a Mockingbird, was the luckiest day of his life. And equally lucky for Pakula and Mulligan, certainly, as Peck, though 44 at this time, had maintained his box office draw. Just before this film, he scored two major hits with The Guns of Navarone and Cape Fear. But his enthusiasm and his generosity and consideration during the shoot really set the tone for one of the most trouble-free major productions in the history of Hollywood. Now, another equally critical choice that Pakula got just right was the casting of the children, brother and sister Jem and Scout, and their little friend Dill. And by the way, that's another reason that the big studios had passed on Mockingbird. There was kind of a rule of thumb in Hollywood around this time that pictures with major child roles only succeeded if they were made by Disney. Now, what's interesting is that when Walt Disney saw To Kill a Mockingbird, he said, "That's the kind of film I wish I could make." At the time, he felt creatively stuck, producing profitable but shallow family comedies like The Absent-Minded Professor. But with the children, there was one critical point on which Pakula and Mulligan were in total agreement. They did not want Hollywood-trained child actors. And that's a decision which, although it worked out, could have easily backfired. For example, the producers of Lord of the Flies, which was filmed before but released a few months after Mockingbird, the producers of that film had also decided to use non-professional actors to play the British schoolchildren stranded on the island. And they cast that film pretty much solely on the basis of looks. And on that level, they did a great job, especially with the major characters. I mean, they look exactly as I'd pictured them when I read Golding's novel. The problem, which becomes apparent the minute they open their mouths, is they can't act. It's painfully obvious that they're just reciting memorized lines off a page. I mean, it could have been the fact that there were so many children in Lord of the Flies that the highly accomplished director, Peter Brook, just didn't have time to shape their performances. Add on the fact that it was shot in rural areas of Puerto Rico, so completely out of the children's comfort zone, and unlike Mockingbird, their parents weren't there. But to me, it's a very unfortunate, fatal flaw in a film with a number of surface virtues. Now, one of the three child actors in Mockingbird, a 9-year-old New Yorker named John Megna, who plays Dill, a character based on Truman Capote, Harper Lee's real-life childhood friend, he did have limited stage experience in New York. But it was the first film for Megna, who was the only one of the three kids who would go on to be a lifelong actor, mostly on TV, although he was cast in a supporting role in The Godfather Part 2 as the young Hyman Roth, the Lee Strasberg character, but all his scenes were cut. But the children who played Jem and Scout, Philip Alford and Mary Badham, were both from Birmingham, Alabama, so no coaching required as far as the accent was concerned, but Alfred's only experience was a local production of The King and I, and Mary Badham, who plays Scout, had no experience whatsoever. Pakula had hired a casting director named Bodie Boatwright, a Southerner and a legendary talent spotter, to scour the Deep South for kids who might fit these roles. So multiple regional auditions were held in 4 states, and out of 2,000 applicants, Alfred and Badham were picked and sent to New York for screen tests, for which Mulligan did not have them prepare anything. He just rolled the camera and talked to them. And what he was looking for was intelligence and a kind of spontaneous authenticity. As he later said, professional Hollywood child actors often fall into or are led into the trap of feeling they have to act like children, when the truth is, they are children. So on a certain level, especially in a drama, they shouldn't have to act. So Mulligan's great task, as he saw it, was to get these young novice actors to just relax and be themselves. And he got a big assist in that department from Gregory Peck, who had the children over to his house more than once to play with his own kids and to get them comfortable with him. And on the set, he allowed them to come into his trailer, he taught Alfred how to play chess, and both children's comfort with him and his enjoyment of them is clearly evident in the film. And the general approach Mulligan used to relax the children was, first of all, to be completely non-judgmental. He said kids are always in the position of trying to please or impress some adult, whether it's their parents or their teachers or their coaches, and he didn't want them to think of him that way. And another important element was plenty of rehearsals on set, which would gradually, almost seamlessly transition into the actual shooting. In other words, he'd have them run their lines for any given scene, and all the while the cameras and crew would be incrementally moving in. So there was hardly a demarcation between the rehearsing and the shooting. And a number of scenes in the final film are first takes, which is pretty remarkable considering the fact that these kids had no experience. So obviously the kids themselves deserve a lot of credit, and Badham was nominated for Best Supporting Actress. But certainly Mulligan as well, with a big assist from Gregory Peck, who stayed friends with Mary Badham, who's now 70, until he died. And she always called him Atticus, and he always called her Scout, which is kind of nice. Now, To Kill a Mockingbird features a number of black actors, but really 2 with major supporting roles, and they're both terrific. And I wish I could tell you a whole bunch of fascinating facts about Estelle Evans, who plays Calpurnia, the Finch's housekeeper who doubles as a kind of mother figure for Jem and Scout. But there really isn't much information to be found about her. A few things. Born in the Bahamas in 1905, the eldest of 18 children, moved to New York City at some point, and at the time they were casting this film, she was a public school teacher and part-time theater actress. To me, her primary asset is her rather unique voice, which she modulates with great expressiveness. That quiver of fear when she sees the mad dog in the street and hurries the children into the house. That agitated stage whisper when she disciplines Scout, firmly but not harshly, for being rude to a dinner guest, a backwoods kid who drowns his dinner in syrup. But subtle facial shadings as well, in a handful of exchanges with Peck, as his role in the Tom Robinson case deepens. Shadings that somehow manage to convey concern over the situation, but also appreciation for the work Atticus is doing. Now, in the book, there's a whole chapter devoted to Jem and Scout attending services at Calpurnia's church, which could have been interesting in the film, but I understand why they cut it. It doesn't really advance the story, and the film is over 2 hours as is. But a great casting and a nice supporting performance by Estelle Evans. Brock Peters, who plays Tom Robinson, is nothing short of superb, and that's a tough role in several ways. Similar in one way to Harry Lime in The Third Man, the Orson Welles role, in that all the other characters have been present from the start. So those actors had a chance to kind of ease into their roles and into our perceptions. But since Robinson, who's dealing with this false rape charge, is incarcerated during the early portion of the film, and there are no jailhouse scenes, like Harry Lime, he's talked about but not seen. At least until the big trial comes up, when Brock Peters suddenly materializes, and he really has to pick up the dramatic flag at that point and carry the charge. And boy, does he ever. Another outstanding voice, in this case a rich baritone, and I know James Earl Jones auditioned for this role. He has a lower, more sonorous voice, which works wonders on stage. I saw him in Fences years ago, and he was fantastic. But I don't think he would have worked as well here, as Peters was better looking, and so his accuser, Maella's attraction to him, is somewhat more plausible, and also that very handsomeness would make him more threatening to the white racists in the film, terrified as they are of any hint of interracial attraction. But here, as Tom Robinson, the simmering emotion, the sorrow, the frustration at this almost Kafkaesque situation of being charged with this terrible crime, of which he and everyone else knows he's innocent, and yet still to be utterly doomed. And then, at a key moment, the abrupt transition from all that emotion to stone-faced detachment when he realizes that he's gone too far by making the simple, compassionate remark that he felt sorry for his white accuser. All of this Peters manages to convey while seated in that courtroom with just his face and his voice. It's a riveting performance. Peck later said he actually had to look above Peters' face during their scenes in the courtroom because the emotion radiating from Peters was so strong it was contagious, and Peck felt he needed to hang on to at least a modicum of lawyerly reserve. But I wanted to highlight these two supporting performances because everyone talks about Peck, and it certainly is a great performance in a wonderful role that Peck was born to play. So really as much a triumph of casting as acting. Pakula's original choice had been Jimmy Stewart, who, it's been alleged but never confirmed as far as I could tell, was a little leery of any potential controversy that the film might touch off. I mean, he would have been fine in the role. At the end of the day, he was probably a better actor than Gregory Peck. But it wouldn't have had the same magic it has with Peck, with that magisterial voice and that kind of Lincoln-esque noble bearing. And speaking of Lincoln, Peck made a terrific recording in 1983 with Zubin Mehta and the Los Angeles Philharmonic of a piece for narrator and orchestra composed by Aaron Copland in 1942, Lincoln Portrait. You can find it on Spotify. Beautifully done by Peck. The text he recites includes a few descriptive comments about Lincoln, but mostly it's excerpts from various speeches, including his State of the Union address in 1862 and the Gettysburg Address the following year. Highly recommended. Now, before I move on from acting, I want to give a shout out to two smaller supporting performances, the first of which is off-screen, Kim Stanley's narration. But it's really a role, as she is the adult scout. And one of the main reasons I believe the film is more effective than the novel is just this technique, only possible in the film medium, of hearing an adult character provide insightful narration into her childhood, while at the same time seeing the child she once was. There's something almost magically moving about that technique, and Mulligan actually recycled it in 1971 for the film Summer of '42. Except with a male narrator, which for me didn't work quite as well. But Kim Stanley, mostly a theater actress, did this narration, for which she did not receive a credit for some reason, as a favor to Mulligan, who had directed her on live TV. But here again, an incredibly sensitive performance, carried entirely by her voice. And the final performance I'd like to highlight comes at the very end of the film by one of the all-time greats, Robert Duvall, who plays Boo. And despite the fact that he has maybe 5 minutes of screen time and speaks no lines, it's a role that Duvall, 31 at that time but still basically unknown, took very seriously. It was his decision to dye his hair blonde and stay out of the sun for several weeks to give this reclusive character a pale, almost albino appearance. And there's a wonderful touch when you first see him. He's standing behind a door after having saved the two children from Bob Ewell, the orchestrator of the false rape charge. And when the light in the room first exposes him, Duvall sort of narrows his eyes, like a shy animal that's been living in a cage. And every frame of this wordless performance is perfect, and everyone knew it. Years later, Gregory Peck said, quote, "That's a lesson in screen acting, that Bob was able to convey so much in a glance, of shyness, of awkwardness, of some kind of deep affection for the child, being exposed to other people as a recluse. All these things he conveyed with the most subtle expression, and really it came from deep inside of Bob," unquote. And it's true. Duvall later said that when he approached the bed where the unconscious Jem was resting, and after receiving permission from Scout, reached out to touch the boy's hair, he got goose pimples. And he said that's when he knew he was on the right track with this role, that he could basically do no wrong at that point if he was having that kind of physical reaction. But looking at Duvall's career, I mean, it's not like this role instantly catapulted him to stardom. I was just watching Bullet, the Steve McQueen film released in 1968, so 6 years after Mockingbird. And there's Duvall playing what was probably his 100th walk-on role as a cab driver with 2 or 3 lines. So really it took The Godfather, at which point he was past 40, to break down that wall and launch him into the big time. But better late than never. Actually, Robert Duvall, now 92, is the last surviving adult cast member of To Kill a Mockingbird. So the final critical element in this film that really catapults it into rare excellence is the musical score, by a guy who had been around, certainly, but was really hitting his stride in the early 60s, Elmer Bernstein. Here, in one of the most influential scores in the history of Hollywood, Bernstein captures that sense of childlike wonder through use of the Lydian mode. For non-musicians, that's a scale with a somewhat mystical, almost otherworldly quality. And Bernstein struggled with the main theme. You know, sometimes Hollywood composers are able to produce remarkable scores virtually at the drop of a hat. On Chinatown, 10 days separated the moment Jerry Goldsmith set pen to paper and the recording session of that fantastic score. But it took several weeks for Bernstein to construct the children's theme that accompanies Stephen Frankfurt's magical opening credit montage, which brings you right into the children's world with images of that cigar box in which Boo Radley leaves gifts for the children. Actually, Frankfurt didn't want any music there. And at first, all you hear is an off-screen child making wordless sounds as she plays with this box. But eventually a marble rolls across the screen, and just as it strikes another marble, the music gently begins in support of a truly unforgettable opening credit sequence. And the key for Bernstein that unlocked the door was thinking about what a child does when he or she goes to the piano. And what they do most of the time is play one note at a time, which is precisely how the theme begins. A simple single-note C major melody played on the upper register of the piano, which then blossoms into this incredible piece of music. Bernstein was nominated for this score, but lost out to Maurice Jarre for Lawrence of Arabia. I would not have voted that way. Bernstein would have to wait until 1968 to win the Oscar for the insipid, thoroughly modern Millie, a score as unoriginal as this one is original. What should have won that year is Lalo Schifrin's score for Cool Hand Luke, Idiots. Now, in closing, I will say that To Kill a Mockingbird is a film that I approached, or reapproached, I saw it as a kid, without enormous enthusiasm, just because it is a message movie. And living in a time now where everything is a message movie, with a sermon to be found in literally every former place of refuge. I mean, you can't watch an NFL game anymore without being bombarded with messages. End racism, printed in every end zone. Choose love, printed on the back of every helmet. And it's the glibness that bothers me. These cheap slogans and hashtags masquerading as virtue. So if you're like me, and you find unsolicited moral instruction from the NFL, of all places, and Hollywood, of all places, and various corporate entities really tiresome, you may, as I did, think twice about viewing or reviewing a message movie. But happily, To Kill a Mockingbird is the platonic ideal of a message movie done just right. It doesn't really preach, at least not aggressively. It isn't overbearing. It makes its points and it moves on. And the truth is, and this may have been an accident of timing more than anything, it was released in December of 1962 at just the right time for its message, on the threshold of a pivotal year of the Civil Rights Movement, 1963. A year when every fitful step forward towards some sort of progress seemed to be immediately followed by some terrible setback. Two examples would be the contentious but ultimately peaceful integration of the University of Alabama in June of '63, brilliantly engineered by Robert Kennedy, followed immediately by the assassination of Medgar Evers, civil rights leader in Mississippi. And then, later that summer, the peaceful March on Washington, where Martin Luther King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech, followed just 2 weeks later by that awful church bombing in Birmingham, where the 4 little girls were killed. And of course, in the spring of '63, you had the whole Birmingham campaign led by King and others, with a villain straight out of Central Casting, Police Commissioner Bull Connor, and photos and films of those demonstrations and the police dogs and the fire hoses beamed all over the world. And all year, as these historic events played out, here was this black and white film playing in theaters nationwide, functioning as a kind of Greek chorus to the nightly news. A period piece, yes, it takes place in the 1930s, but as with many period pieces, very much of its time. If you look at Bonnie and Clyde, for example, which takes place during the same time period, that's a film very much about 1967, the year it was released. Chinatown, I just mentioned, also takes place during the 30s, very much about the 70s. But just to nail down my final point, if you're a little leery about sitting down for a 2-hour-plus message movie in an era where everything's a lecture, don't be. First of all, it's very artfully done. It's an absolute pleasure to watch. And the racial theme is handled with much more sensitivity and sophistication than you might expect from a 60-year-old film. And the truth is, the film, which, as I said, really has two storylines, although they do dovetail at the end, the Boo Radley story and the trial, the film deals with race, certainly, but it's about more than just that. It's really a kind of plea for humanity, for understanding, and at the same time a demonstration by its protagonist, Atticus Finch, of what it means to stand up and speak out in the face of evil, even when all the odds are stacked against you. So don't hesitate to check it out. My #1 film for 1962, To Kill a Mockingbird. Back in a moment. Your feedback is important to us. On Twitter, @Realtime1960s, on our Facebook page, or you can email the program, realtime1960s@gmail.com. Really, however you'd like to engage with us, we love engaging with you. And if you'd like to join our family and help us continue to bring you great content, please go to patreon.com/realtime1960s and subscribe. Don't forget to visit us at realtime1960s.com for our timeline, each and every podcast, links to social media, how to reach us directly, everything you need to know about this portal into the past that we are creating. And stay tuned for our next episode, where I will immediately commence discussion of my top 10 films released in 1963. So take care, and I'll see you soon.